Hi everyone, welcome to this fortnightly Tools of Frontline staff session. Today we're joined by Helena, who's from the Hackney Housing Services team, and she's going to talk about their proposed new additional needs policy, which is out for consultation. So I'm going to pass across to Helena.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Can I just check how long I've got to sort of do my little bit of a talk? I don't want to run over and take up all the time.
As long as you want, because you're the only person presenting, so
fine, no problem. Great, that's great. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen, so just bear with me 1 second. Thank you so much for having me, and I will just put that into right view. Right, is that in the right view now? Okay, so feel free at any point to shout, to chat, whatever. It works better probably if you ask questions as we go, and we can kind of use the slides as more of a prompt to talk about rather than anything more formal. So yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm here to talk about our new supporting residents with additional needs to thrive housing policy. So just a bit of sort of overview and background to this. We are committed. So housing currently is in the process of kind of a transformation. We're looking to kind of change the way that we work. One of the most sort of key bits of that really is recognising that all our residents are different and not everybody needs the same service from us. We currently operate a little bit of a one-size-fits-all type approach, which doesn't work for people who tend to have different needs and different requirements from their housing service. So we recognise that there is a whole range of factors that can affect how people engage with services, what they need from services, how they might feature more or less in certain areas, and might be victim to discrimination or disadvantage or inequality or various other sort of negative outcomes as a consequence of some of those additional needs, and so on. So the kind of purpose really of this policy is to try and acknowledge that and make that be clear that we understand that that's the case. We want our staff to be able to recognise where the residents have additional needs or might be more vulnerable. We then want to make sure that everybody knows how to respond to that effectively, and make sure that they record that in the systems that we hold as well, because one of the bits of feedback that we hear quite a lot is, well, I've told you all of this before, why are you making me tell my story again? You already know that I need an interpreter, or you already know that I need longer to get to the door, or whatever it might be. Why are you not taking that into account? And I have to keep telling you. So a bit like with safeguarding, what we're trying to instill in the housing staff is that this is everybody's responsibility. This isn't like a niche requirement that sits with some officers and not others. It really is for everybody to kind of understand the principles in this policy. So as I say, we have learnt really through our work, through our casework, through complaints, through members' inquiries, satisfaction surveys, and as part of proper research. So we've undertaken research, focus groups, and so on with some residents. It's been really clear that we are missing opportunities to recognise, respond to and record where residents have additional needs and need reasonable adjustments. And as a consequence, that means they're at risk of worse outcomes when accessing services from housing. And I think when we had our recent anti-racism summit a little while ago, I think I referenced this point there. I'm not saying that we've got evidence that certain groups of people are being discriminated against by our services, or that there is inequality or disproportionality, but I'm also not saying that there isn't, because I've got no evidence. So my feeling is, where you can't evidence something, you have to almost assume that it potentially is present. And so that's why we have to take steps to try and collect the evidence, to collect the data, to build our understanding and make sure that any of those issues are not actually playing out in our services. So to kind of underline this approach, those of you who know anything about housing will know we have a very active housing ombudsman. So they oversee all of the kind of complaints that come in about housing services across the country and sort of aggregate all of the data that they learn from those complaints. And they produce these spotlight reports, which are kind of deep dives into specific areas of their casework, which then tells us, you know, big picture, what are some of the issues that are being missed across the whole of the housing sector. So they're really, really helpful evidenced kind of reports that give us a steer on where we need to be going. I've put the link in the slides here to the relevant spotlight report that mentions quite a lot of these issues. It's a really interesting read, and anyone who's interested in housing and equalities issues, I would definitely recommend that people take a look at it, because it is really good. When I talk about additional needs, when we were putting this policy together, there was some discussion about vulnerability, whether we used the word vulnerability, but I think we felt that didn't really capture the full range of issues that we were talking about. For a start, not everybody defines themselves as vulnerable. It's not a particularly positive kind of label that a lot of people identify with. And also, some of the issues that we're talking about are to do with protected characteristics, and we certainly aren't implying that having a protected character, we all have protected characteristics to some extent. So, you know, it's not implying that people who've got protected characteristics are de facto vulnerable, but it is acknowledging that things like racism obviously affect some people disproportionately, homophobia affects people disproportionately. So there are definitely plays around, you know, interplays with protected characteristics, but those things don't de facto make somebody vulnerable. So the way we've defined it is we define residents with additional needs as residents who, due to their personal characteristics, circumstances, or life events, may be either currently or permanently less able to achieve equal access to housing services or equal outcomes when accessing our services. And the thing there about permanence is we know that not everything that might make somebody more vulnerable to these negative outcomes is a permanent, you know, thing. People go through stages of their lives where their vulnerability or their risk or their sensitivity to particular issues might ebb and flow. So again, we don't want to tar people, you know, once vulnerable, forever vulnerable. It doesn't really work like that, and that's not what our residents recognise. So the policy objectives that we want to try and achieve with this policy, we want to make sure that residents with additional needs receive good quality help and support to sustain their tenancies and maintain their home and well-being, and that they're also able to access housing services fairly and don't experience any worse outcomes when using services than residents who do not have additional needs. So that's what we're trying to essentially get at with this work. So just to move us on, so to achieve this, I think we recognise there's a huge amount of training that we need to do. I think our officers are on a real change curve in terms of their expertise, their knowledge, their ability to kind of deal with these issues, because like I say, there have been sort of forays into this in the past. Obviously, people have had safeguarding training. I think some of the work, Charles, you've been doing is really tried to promote that kind of different way of working, but we're still quite a long way away from where we need to be, and a lot of that is to do with training and support for our staff. So that's a big issue. I think the second big issue that we need to address is around the systems and the processes that we have in place to collect the data. I'm not going to go into the cyber attack, we all know the sort of history of that, but you know, currently the housing system that we have is not really fit for purpose and hasn't been for some time. We're in the process currently of procuring a new housing IT system, so there's a huge amount of opportunity that's coming from that, and it's really important that we're starting to embed that data culture in housing now. We can't wait for the new system to arrive. So it's thinking about, you know, how do we record things, how do we what do we ask for? You know, one of the things that's really obvious to me when I look at what we do in housing, we don't actually collect protected characteristics in any kind of uniform way. It's not recorded in the system. We've got huge gaps around even some of our household composition. You go into the records that we hold, it will have the main tenant, but it won't have all the children in the household, which is obviously a real concern, even, you know, well, for all kinds of reasons. But if you think about safeguarding and all of that, it's clearly very worrying. And we don't have anywhere to consistently record adjustments that need to be made. So if somebody is blind and needs braille, somebody does need longer to get to the door or whatever, there's nowhere in the system currently for us to be able to record that. So clearly that's a work in progress. And then obviously having the data is just one element of this. So what do we do when we've got it? It is about that, providing those reasonable adjustments in a really consistent way, and making sure people don't have to keep telling us about the same things over and over again. It's to enable us to start monitoring outcomes around access to the service and the outcomes that we're achieving, particularly in specific areas where we know these things might play out more. So for example, within our ASB caseload, you know, there is a potential that certain groups could be disproportionately represented within those groups of residents. And, you know, are we making sure that if that is the case, we're working with the right people to kind of mitigate and resolve any inequalities that might be coming through? And obviously that learning then leads us into the sort of service redesign element, which is around who are the partners that we need to be working with? Are we making sure they're really joined up and coherent? And are we tweaking our own service provision to make sure that it is adjusting itself as it needs to work with people who've got more complex or multiple needs or whatever it might be? So I've put on here just some of the principles that we're kind of using to underpin the policy. We want to really embed a trauma-informed way of working in housing. That's not something really that word gets used quite a lot in housing, or in the council, but I think a lot of the time people don't fully understand what that means. So I think we need to do a bit of a deep dive into that in housing and really get people thinking in that more trauma-informed way. We want to recognise that disadvantage and deprivation contribute to vulnerability. So this is an equalities issue as well. We want to be really resident-centric, so making sure we're listening to what people tell us, putting ourselves in their shoes, noticing what's going on, helping navigate the system. Charles, this is what you do all the time. We know how difficult it is for us as officers. So how on earth it must be sometimes for residents, I can only imagine. We want to be really preventative as well. So we're intervening early and recognising early when somebody needs some additional help, not waiting for it to get to a crisis. We want to avoid making assumptions about people, so letting them tell us what they need rather than making assumptions and assuming we know best. We want to be responsive. So I think anyone who, again, has worked with housing for a while will know we've not always been very good at that. We don't always get back to people. We don't always deliver good customer service. So I think that really needs to change. And again, getting away from that one size fits all. Not everyone's the same. So what we give to one person might not be what the second person needs. Then thinking about being strength-based, so not just seeing people as problems, not just seeing people in a negative sort of deficit-based way, but thinking about how they can take ownership of their own lives, how they can solve their own problems and become, you know, the kind of masters of their own destiny a little bit where possible, recognising not everyone will be in the same place for those things at all times. Being really honest with people and transparent about what we can and can't do. I think that comes back to treating people like adults and recognising, you know, we operate in a very imperfect system. We can't do everything, but we have to be honest and truthful about what we can and can't do so people can make their own informed decisions about how we help them. Avoid blaming people. You know, when things are going wrong that aren't their fault, we mustn't stigmatise or blame those people. Particularly in areas where relationships are very important. So again, I'm thinking about around antisocial behaviour, community cohesion, some of the neighbour disputes that we get. You know, at times my observations are that we can actually exacerbate some of that sometimes in a totally inadvertent way. And actually, how do we rethink that and think about repair, restoring relationships, rebuilding relationships, rather than kind of labeling people perpetrators or, you know, being quite punitive, where actually all that does is exacerbate a problem rather than resolve it. Obviously promoting sort of partnerships, seeking the expertise of other services. We are not social workers, we're not police, we're not medical professionals. You know, we are part of the system, and it's important that we recognise that and work within it as best as we can. Promoting equalities, challenging discrimination, that should be without that should go without saying, but sometimes I think, you know, it needs to be really underlined. We have to be really safety focused, we're really aware of risks, and we have to make sure that residents and communities are involved at all stages of this process. So that's the kind of principles in a nutshell. So the next bit I wanted to do was just give you a little example. So this is a guy who I worked with a little while ago. He was in a terribly distressed state when I got involved with his case. He had a very severe anxiety disorder, to the extent that he'd had multiple hospital admissions throughout his life. He'd been quite suicidal at times and had self-harmed quite significantly in the past as a result of this anxiety problem that he had. The issue that had triggered this interaction was that his boiler had broken, and he had no heating on hot water for quite an extended period of time throughout, when it wasn't very warm outside either. And it was because we couldn't get access to do the repair. So what had happened, the contractors had tried to go in, they tried to do the work, but the manner in which they kind of interacted with Ted, not his real name, really upset him, to the extent that he got to the point he just couldn't have them in the home. And when he explained to me about how it made him feel, it was like they just sort of, his words, kind of barged in, treated the place like it was their space, like, oh, it's a council home, we've got a right to be here, kind of didn't respect his boundaries, didn't tell him what they were doing. Things like he wanted a schedule of works, he wanted to understand why they were moving a cupboard, you know, and they didn't really give him that information. So he just felt they were just completely bowling over him and sort of not listening to him, and he felt really, really stressed out by it. And like I say, to the extent that he ended up in the emergency A&E with an attack of, you know, his anxiety, and we were quite worried about him for a while. And then there was an issue with a complaint as well, where again he felt he was being given the brush off and not really treated, that he felt people just weren't listening to what he was saying. So we ended up speaking with his advocate. He had a brilliant advocate who was really, really supportive, and made sure that we arranged the visits to happen when his advocate could be present. So rather than just dropping in and trying to do the work in that way, we set it all up, arranged it, we gave him loads of notice. We appointed an officer from our resident sustainment team as well, so they could do the kind of negotiating between the contractor and the advocate, and he wouldn't have to do that himself. And we gave him that full schedule of work, so he knew exactly what to expect, when it was going to happen, and the reasons for it. So not just telling him we're doing this, we're actually explaining to him why we're doing it, and that was really important to him. And actually it did resolve, and you know, he was very insightful and very helpful in the sort of development of this work, because he could really pinpoint the things that had happened along the way that had kind of got the situation to where it was. And you know, there was a lot of learning really from that, simple basic adjustments that we could have made that would have got this whole situation resolved better, much quicker, cheaper for the council, better for him. Everybody would have been much happier. So it is a win-win if we get this stuff right, because I've got to be honest, the contractors were equally getting very frustrated, because they're like, we want to just get in there and do the work and close the job down. So, you know, but they needed to realize they couldn't just do it the way that they were. So that's just an example of the type of thing we're talking about. So that's what I've given you there, is a really kind of quick run through of the kind of basic policy, the reasons for it, and the kind of thing we're hoping to kind of achieve with it. We are out for consultation currently, so like I mentioned, we've done some targeted work already to kind of research what we need to put in to this, including focus groups and work with some people using the services that we have. We're doing some more of that currently, so we're doing some work with care leavers as a specific cohort of residents who would potentially fall within this category. That's going on now. We've also done loads of sort of reach out to tenant resident associations, tenant management organisations, to our resident steering groups and so on as well, to try and get their views. And obviously reaching out to partners like yourselves, statutory partners as well, trying to really get as many people as possible to kind of take a look over the policy. So the final sort of stages of this, once the consultation closes on at the beginning of September, we'll obviously analyse all of the responses that we've had, feed that back into the report. I'm sure there'll be things we need to adjust and change as a consequence. So that'll all be built in. And then the policy will go to Cabinet in November if it is signed off. So we're already kind of working on an action plan. I like to be on the front foot with these things. Obviously, nothing's set in stone really until the final policy is decided, but there's some things here that I think, you know, it's a no-brainer that we're going to have to sort the data out. It just is what it is. So we might as well put it on the plan now. And some of the procedures as well. So some of the things that we know we need to get better at, there's procedures that are very out of date. So for example, right now I'm looking at a hoarding procedure. Charles, obviously we've talked about this before, haven't we? It's a key area where I feel like we don't always get it right. So looking at some of those procedures now, planning the training, and like I say, thinking about those key partnerships. We're looking at developing a joint working protocol with social care and health around how we work together on some of these more complex cases. And then thinking about the kind of wider quality assurance. How are we evidencing the outcomes? How are we evidencing that we're actually making the change that we want to see? So that might take a bit longer, and obviously until we start collecting the data in a consistent way, it will be quite difficult. But I think there's still, you know, there's little bits that we can be doing now. We don't have to wait for everything to be perfect to start providing ourselves with some of that assurance. So I think that was the last thing I had to share with you. So yeah, that was my last slide. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pause, and I'm going to hand back for any questions.
Thanks, Helena. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Krista.
Straight in, I was making notes. Don't laugh, Charles. I've been off for 3 days, so I'm raring to go again. It's been a busy first day back, actually. So I wanted to start with something nice, because I saw you were talking about housing. I know I missed the beginning of it, but I knew what the remit was about on the presentation. I've got a resident who shall remain nameless, a lady with significant learning disabilities who recently had to get moved due to physical disability from the property that she was in, which was I believe a second or third floor flat with a lift that used to break all the time. So she was dealt with very well by the housing. It was quite a stressful procedure for her to get all the medical stuff together that she needed to gather. She was a bit confused. Eventually, a particular housing officer, I can't remember her name actually, I'll find out so I can give good feedback, took her on and sent her a nice list of exactly what she needed to get. And then she came to me for support. Great success story. She's been rehoused in 5 weeks. She rang me today and her bidding has worked, and she's got a new place up in Upper Clapton now. She's over the moon. Like, I've never seen it move so fast. However, so off the flip side of that success story, and it was a real success story, so kudos where it's due, her learning disabilities are significant, and the bidding process for her was super complicated. So I supported her every Friday morning, and my boss kept laughing at me saying, Christy, you don't need to do that. But she needed somebody she could trust just for that 10 minutes who could log in with her online. And I would send that. We found a way, just like you used TED as an example, just a little thing. So I would go through it with her. Anything that she sounded interested in, I would screenshot and put in a WhatsApp group so she could see it there and then the chat, and she could respond to it there, because looking at it all was too much for her. The size of the font that was being used on the bidding website was too small for her to read, stuff like that. So some thought could maybe just be fed in to helping residents, because she was more or less told that there was nothing they could do. She would have to get somebody to help her do the bidding. So maybe no, she doesn't have any social workers. That she's got some learning disability support, Janet, up at St Leonard's, but she chose to sort of ask me to help us, and I didn't mind doing it. It's like 10 minutes on a Friday, and it's worked. But just thinking ahead, if something consideration could be given to residents that do have learning disabilities that might really, she's got tablets, she's very accessible, she's got a smartphone, but she can't digest all that information in one go. And maybe having someone to support people like that through the bidding process could be a good tool to offer residents as well, especially with people with language disabilities and stuff. Last couple of points I wanted to add on was if you want to do any focus groups, I work with over 50 residents that volunteer for Health Watch, so they feed into a lot of policy stuff, so more than happy to help accommodate that if that's of any interest to you. And any comms you want to share, just feel free to send it across. And I've got, like Charles, I've got quite a wide remit, so if you want to share anything out to people, just let me know and I'll get it out as well.
That's amazing. I think it would be really good if you, so I've put the link to the consultation page in the slides, which hopefully we can kind of share and send round as part of this presentation. It's on the website anyway, but I can signpost it. So I think anyone who can promote this with their residents, you know, the people they're working with, there's a questionnaire people can fill in. You can fill it in as an agency, or you can get your residents to fill it in as well, just to give us some feedback. That would be super duper helpful. I'd much appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be putting the slides, if that's all right, Helena, in the newsletter. That's obviously got the links to everything. So you know, everyone who's on the mailing list who isn't on this call will get it as well. Any other questions for Helena?
I mean, I've happily talked to you, Helena, about this for hours. But is there anyone else before I ask any questions? I guess I'll come in with one. I guess something we speak about in other spaces is like, yes, staff being trauma informed and kind of the culture change that needs to happen in the council about how we work with residents. But something about that is about like how staff are as well being re-traumatized because of like the kind of cases they're dealing with and the kind of secondhand exposure. Like I stopped being a frontline officer 2 years ago. I'm still waking up in the middle of the night thinking about cases that were on my caseload. So it's just something about like, how do we, being a housing officer is a really difficult job. You're aware, I'm aware. I know others on the call, including Claire, is aware. Like, how do we protect staff, those housing staff who are kind of encountering these kind of very varied queries? Like we said before, you could be dealing with a murder 1 minute and someone talking about foxes the next. How do you protect their kind of well-being in that transition? Is that kind of part being thought about?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in my previous borough, I was at Islington before I was here. We actually restructured the service to have, we kind of went with the sort of with the grain kind of way of organising the service, recognising that some people are much more inclined towards working with people who've got more complex needs and some people aren't. And actually, we shouldn't have round pegs and square holes. You know, some people are really good at doing estate inspections and checking that things are working and is that sign up on the wall. And some people want to do more, more of that human sort of facing work. So we restructured the service around that kind of idea, and we established sort of more specialist teams to deal with domestic abuse, multiple disadvantages, and so on. And we found that that was really good because it meant we could at least have people with the right values. Because a lot of this, let's be honest, it's about the behaviours and the values and the competencies as much as it is anything else. And you can train somebody forever, but if they're not the right sort of person, it's going to be more difficult for them. And then what we were able to do was we set up clinical supervision for the people in those teams. So basically, as you would if you were an IDVA or you were doing some of that more specialist work, we actually had a psychologist who would come in and run sessions for people so that they could have that space to kind of think about what had gone on at work and how they were kind of taking care of themselves as well. And I think it's but to me, that isn't the heart of being trauma informed. Trauma informed isn't one-way traffic. It's about staff as well, and it's about making a space safe for people to share their fears and their because you said it yourself, housing officers go home worrying about their tenants, and we always feel like we're not doing enough to help people or to protect them, and we carry a lot of that around. And I think if people aren't helped to deal with that, it can be quite a lonely place, and it definitely leads to sort of workplace burnout. So I think as our service evolves, that's definitely what I would be hoping to move towards. Hackney is so for anybody on the call who is from housing, they'll know we've got a service restructure that's coming up, and the sort of workforce plan that sits alongside that. How do we support the workforce, to me, is a really critical part of the change we need to see. So all of the things you said there, I would be hoping would be feeding into that kind of process moving forwards. Hope that helps a bit.
I mean, thank you. It does. And just to say, like, from where I was in the service 2 years ago, this is all looking like an incredible amount of positive change. And thank you for sharing it with us. I mean, I've got some more questions as well, but
Fire away.
well, something that comes up a lot in my kind of conversations with different partners in the social sector is, for us, the distinction between a Hackney Council tenant and other types of resident are very clear because we know who we have the contract with. But that is not true for the tenant themselves or the resident, the voluntary sectors they're working with. I mean, it's just something to say, like, I've had organisations comment to me that they're worried about a two-tier system happening in Hackney. Mm-hmm. Well, one between Hackney Housing and temporary accommodation, but also Hackney Housing and other RSLs. So it's just like, I wonder, like, how does this policy feed into how we're operating as a whole council with temporary accommodation, but also how we feed into our colleagues in like Peabody or Southern? I know that's a tricky question. Housing is very fractured and difficult, but it's just something that comes up a lot for us.
It really is. And I think it's a bit like when I say we, housing officers, when we try to understand health, health, it's one thing, isn't it? But my goodness, it is a complicated creature. And until you are in them, and it's different in all kinds of, it was different in Islington from what it is here. And, it is really, really hard. And I think people do kind of homogenize housing as a thing when it isn't. It's so multifaceted and multi-organizational. Just on the sort of intersection with benefits and homeless prevention in the TA sort of area, my feeling is that historically we have operated very separately and the relationship has been quite separate. And I think there's historical reasons for that, which I'm not going to go into, but there are reasons down in the dark days of stuff that perhaps went on a long time ago. We're kind of past that now. And I think, I did a mutual exchange event a little while ago where I was talking to residents and, they talk about housing. They include the temporary accommodation team. They include benefits and homeless prevention. They don't see the delineations between the departments. And frankly, why should they? It doesn't matter to them at all what team you're in. It's irrelevant. So I think trying to kind of work. So I talk about hiding the wiring. It's like, when you turn on a light switch, you press one button, the light comes on. But there's a whole load of technology and stuff that sits behind that, which you don't need to see. You don't need to know what that is. And I guess the vision is that we end up in a housing world where we press the button and the light comes on and what goes on behind the scenes is invisible. I think we are a hell of a long way away from that. But I think at least there is an understanding that that's where we need to get to. And a commitment from everybody involved to try and make that kind of happen. I think with the wider housing world, I don't think we're there at all. And, I don't quite know how we would resolve that, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, I know there's been some work done recently around a strategic sort of housing assessment to look at essentially a housing needs assessment for the whole of Hackney, which takes into account sort of the private sector, supply issues. Obviously, housing associations are a big source of supply for us. Are we maximising that, and so on? And again, referring you back to that spotlight report that the Ombudsman put together, there's a big discussion in there around kind of future-proofing your housing stock for the needs of the next generation. It's not just about the people that we've got now, it's who's coming through down the line. And what we know is the levels of complex needs and vulnerability and additional needs, they're not going to get less. If anything, it's probably going to get more, to be honest. That's been the trend we've seen. So I think we do need to think very carefully about that point that you made. And I think it is one for the housing strategy. That's where the document needs to kind of set out what that vision is. And then I guess we need to use our role as sort of strategic leaders in the place to try and pull everyone together around that kind of shared endeavour. Probably a bit above this policy in terms of that sort of aspiration, but that's certainly what I'm hearing when I go to meetings, with Jennifer and James Goddard, who's writing the housing strategy, and with Ricardo and people like that. And obviously the links into the supported housing programme, what are we building, who are we building it for, and so on. So yeah, I feel like, again, that we're starting to go in the right direction, but there's a heck of a long way to go, I would say.
Thank you. I mean, yeah.
Not just adding, Charles, just to add on to your comment about two-tier housing, different element of it, but to give you an example, I've heard from a lot of residents recently about a text that went out from the council. If you wanted to register yourself as a CIC or get this training to do your community project, you come and join this course. And it had a really good response from residents across the borough. They were delighted that the council were offering this. Turned out it was only open to council tenants. So it wasn't open to private renting. It wasn't open to housing association. It wiped out, like I say, probably 80% of the borough's other tenants, I would say. So there was quite a sort of not unrest, but quite a bit of sort of about that. People sort of there is a among residents. So you've obviously got your own internal stuff going on with tiers and how it works, but at resident level as well, it is really a feeling of, oh, we can't access the same things because we're not actually a council tenant, and maybe bridging relations with residents would be good to address little things like that. That should be open to all Hackney residents as opposed to just our own council residents, kind of thing. Just suggestion.
I think it's particularly interesting as well. If you think about the tenure mix on some of our estates now, it's not even as simple as we've got an area where all the private tenants live and an area where all the housing, you know, we PA next to private sector subtenants of leaseholders.
Estate last for 2 years as a community developer up there in the Stamford Hill estate. It was run and owned, so the site was owned by Southern Housing, but you had council tenants that had bought their places, you had private leaseholders, you had HMOs, you had social housing tenants, you had other housing people getting shit. Like the amount of different tenants in there, types of tenancy alone, I would have said a good 8 or 9 different types of tenancy were feeding into that, and that's just one estate in Hackney. So I think if you're offering us, this is a lighter thing than system and policy, but if you're offering a service to one lot of residents, if you want everybody to feel like they're one and there's not this 2-tier them and us thing, then it should be offered to little things like that should be offered to all residents as opposed to just hand-picked council tenant ones. Feedback from us.
Just on that complexity of tenure as well, I could see in the comment in the chat, Pauline put a question about whether TMOs, whether this policy is going to cover also TMO officers.
Definitely.
Yes.
Sorry, Pauline, go ahead.
Yes, good. Because they operate in isolation to the rest of the council. Residents are beside themselves with frustration in terms of knowing who their housing officer is, getting any help with any repairs, just speaking to someone about maybe they want to look at a transfer or just any help. In one case, our link work project, I literally had to go all the way to the top and threaten health and safety to get somebody to respond. That's how difficult I found it, and supporting a resident to get in contact with the TMO. So I don't, it's unclear to me how they work, how they should be working, and yeah.
I'll give you an example on that, Pauline. I echo your concerns, and we're doing some work which I'll mention in just a minute on the TMOs. But this week I was escalated an inquiry that had gone up all the way to Ricardo, who's our strategic our group director for climate homes and economy. So a very, one of the most senior people in the council. And it was about a person who needed a British Sign Language interpreter, and they'd requested it in April, and we're now in August, and we still hadn't managed to sort out a British Sign Language interpreter, which is not a difficult thing to sort out. So it got all the way up to him, who then passed it back down to me, who then managed to sort it out. And I just thought that is exactly the kind of thing that we've got. Like, what is that? That is completely ridiculous that it's got to, and it's just because I think sometimes nobody really knows what they should be doing. And I think like I mentioned, the procedures are out of date. Some of the agreements between us and the TMOs are out of date. So there's all these grey areas where nobody really knows. And I don't think it's because people don't want to help, but they don't sometimes know what to do and where to go, and so it goes into the too difficult box, and then it just doesn't get done. So the work we're doing with the TMOs at the moment is to try and rewrite all of the management agreements that they have with us, because obviously they're arm's length to the council, but the tenants are still council tenants, so we still have a responsibility to them. but it's working out with the TMOs, you know, exactly where all those lines of responsibility start and end. And I think where there's a grey area, you know, that's where we need to be just really, really clear. This is who is responsible for this, and this is who's responsible for that. So we don't have people falling through the cracks like that, because it's not acceptable. And, you know, we're denying somebody basic stuff which they should be able to get fairly easily, just because we don't know really how to sort it out for them.
Yeah, because some residents, because there might be the TMO tenant, but they think they're a council tenant, which in theory they are,
Yeah.
but not sure and not clear of the lines of responsibility that covers them. And then when you say, oh, I'm sorry, you're with a TMO, they're like, what? And that needs to be spelt out. People need to, whether they do monthly meetings with the residents so that residents understand why they're in you know, that's the type of tenancy they have, and they're aware of it, rather than sort of it being sprung up on them and they're surprised and you having to explain and what's a TMO and why are they a TMO tenant, that kind of thing that they just don't understand. And it's through no fault of their own, but it is it does mean that their experience when they come to the council, because as far as they're concerned, they're a council tenant and they're coming to us, and it's this thing of, oh, sorry, you need to be taking this here, all right, you know, and it's not slick at all. It's just, needs looking into.
I hear you. I totally agree. It's definitely something that we're noting.
I was just going to say it might be worth explaining what a TMO is briefly, just because not everyone on the call will have a housing brain like me, Pauline and Helena.
I was just going to ask that. What's a TMO? Well done.
So a TMO is a tenant management organisation. So it's essentially tenants have the right to manage their own housing services if they want to. So they can put in a request to set up their own management organisation to deliver certain elements of what the council would be delivering. So the tenants stay council tenants, but the TMO can appoint staff. They have a board and there's a chair of the board who acts as the kind of governance for that arrangement, and they will deliver some repairs, they'll deliver income services, they'll deliver housing management services, and so on. So it's a bit like, if you remember the old days of ALMOs, so the arm's length management organisations, where it was like Homes for Hackney was set up some years ago, then it all came back in-house. They're a little bit like those, so they're kind of arm's length, so the tenants are still our tenants, but we don't manage them directly, if that makes sense.
Krista, if you think of like if you're coming down Wick Road, there are estates with different branding. Wyke Estate TMO. It's the blue, the ones with the blue signs that aren't the old.
I was thinking Gascoigne is one of those when I said it, because they do all their own managing, don't they, up at Gascoigne, the old Gascoigne bit on Gascoigne 1. Thank you. Thanks. I didn't have a clue what that was. I thought of thinking HMO, but that's different.
That's different, exactly.
I was actually going to ask around, on the back of Pauline's question around sort of communication of policy and communication of people's contexts. How, and this is sort of jumping ahead slightly, but once the policy is agreed, how is that, and then other policies, how are they sort of continually communicated to residents to build that understanding? Because I think sometimes what happens, obviously you do a period of consultation, there's lots of engagement, the policy gets agreed and it kind of, you know, it's on the website, etc., but it's not sort of a living thing for most people. So what would be the plan for making sure that residents actually understand their context, how to make applications, that sort of thing?
So I think that's a key sort of, so those of you again who know about housing will know that we're in a new era of regulation. So as of April this year, the social housing regulator has had the right essentially to come into any local authority and conduct a kind of Ofsted style inspection, where we'll get a rating based on how we measure up to a set of consumer standards. And one of the consumer standards is around transparency. So it is exactly what you've just said. How are we making sure that residents can access those key documents, that they feel they've got an ability to feed into them when they change, you know, and that they stay live. I think in Hackney Housing, historically, a lot of our policies and procedures are quite out of date. Some of them, like this one, you know, we didn't have a policy at all around vulnerabilities before this one was kind of put together. So we are kind of working through the whole list of policies and procedures at the moment to kind of look at when they were last updated. Are they still relevant? What work do we need to do? And also thinking about this new housing IT system that we're getting, how, probably not on the policy side, but more on the procedure side, are we updating them to make sure that they reflect the technology that we currently have? Because again, Charles, you'll probably know some of the old procedures still reference the housing system that we had before the cyber attack, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. So it doesn't really help officers to do their jobs properly if the procedures don't reflect the reality of the work that they're doing. So that's the kind of program that I think we're just starting to kind of develop. Certainly in my previous experience, normally when you do a policy, you put a little thing on the bottom that says you should review this kind of every 3 years. And I'm not saying that every single time you're going to do a massive external sort of consultation exercise as part of that, but I would be expecting to see learning from complaints. You know, if we have identified areas of disproportionality starting to come through from the monitoring, or we need to tweak things, that's where I would expect that to start feeding into those policy reviews. And like I say, you know, every few years, you probably would want to do a more, you know, bigger kind of look at them, just to make sure that some things don't change a lot, some things grow and evolve all the time. And, you know, I think there's been a real lack of sort of capacity put into that before. It's just kind of been left again. I think when the cyber attack happened, a lot of things probably fell by the wayside a little bit, and that was probably one of them. And we're having to kind of play catch up a little bit now, I think. But they should all be on the website. They should all be very available and accessible for people. And, you know, at the moment, I can definitely say that isn't the case.
Thanks, Helena. I think Pauline was just first. Pauline.
Got you there, Charlie. Just one more thing regarding TMOs, because it is a big thing with me. Because with the other residents, whilst it might be slow, I can signpost people to where they need to go, and people know where they have to go. But with regard to TMOs, in the agreement that they've got with the council, can it not be put in there that sort of surgeries need to happen once a month or something, so that residents can participate? You know, there is, so I mean, we have forums where our residents can come in and they can vent, or they can, you know, congratulate, or they can but it doesn't seem to go the same way with TMOs. They're kind of there, and, you know, if there's any problems, they get the runaround. So yeah. If there's, I don't know, in the agreements that we've got with them, if that could be a part of the new agreements, that they must hold them once a month, once a quarter, once, you know, every 2 months or something, so that residents have a point of reference. They can go somewhere, they get to know the people who should be looking after them and stuff. It seems to be, it's really, truly is taken literally arm's length.
Yeah, I think all of those things are potentially in scope for this review that we're doing. So there's kind of legal requirements around what needs to go into the management agreements that we have, and I think that won't cover everything, but I think we need to have a kind of service level agreement as well, in terms of just how the, you know, how reporting works, how quality assurance works, all those kind of things. So like I mentioned, we're going to have funnily enough, the email that I was writing just literally before coming on this call was to try and arrange a workshop with some consultants to come and externally facilitate that, to try and start pinning down, you know, where are the lines of responsibility, who's doing what, how do we get that kind of governance framework in place. And, you know, like you mentioned, having those opportunities to have face-to-face contact with residents, to me, is critical. You know, we're doing it on our side, and I think it is something which everybody really ought to be kind of providing. So I've made a note of that. I think that's a good suggestion.
Thanks, Pauline. Charlie, did you want to come in?
It's a shame Neil's left the call actually, because it was something around that. Something that we've kind of thinking about in other areas of work, Helena, is about how can our partners in the voluntary sector escalate issues and with residents who need extra support to statutory services that aren't reliant on the same kind of main emails that don't get out, take 7 days to get back to. I was just wondering if there's been any thought around an escalation policy for partners, and also, I guess, connected to that, how do we work and share data with both the voluntary sector or people like the Fire Brigade? I'm sure they'll have a list of some of our vulnerable tenants in the same way that we do, that kind of thing.
I spend my whole life talking about data and how we share data and how we make better use of the data we've got and how we collect data that we don't. It is I've got to be honest with you, it is a total, you know as well as I do.
This was my life 2 years ago, Helena.
It is awful. We've got all of these workarounds that people have built for absolutely the right reasons to try and manage as best we can, but I can't underestimate how running a service for 30,000 people, 30,000 households with no system, I can't even put into words how difficult that is. And I take my hats off to the people that have been doing it a lot longer than me, because it is a real bane of my life. And again, earlier on today, I was saying, we need to rationalize. We've got everything's on a Google form, but then where do those Google forms go? How do they feed into the aggregated dashboards that officers see? Are we still asking slightly different versions of the same questions in multiple places and then failing to put the data together? Well, I can tell you the answer is definitely yes, we are doing that. So for me, I almost think it almost needs to be burnt down and started again, because it's got so complicated and there's so many layers upon layers upon layers. So as part of the policy and procedure work that we're doing, I'm being really, really clear that that has to include the data element. So that has to include how is it monitored, how is the data captured, where does the data go, and not in a vague way. Literally, if you want it in a Google form, where does that Google form then go into the dashboard? How do the officers see it, and so on. So there's all that bit of kind of background infrastructure that we're trying to kind of resolve. And like I said, we've got this new housing management system coming, but we're still a long way, that could still take years to fully roll out all the modules, because you can imagine it's quite a lot of work to do all of that. So we can't just wait for that. We've got to, what are we doing now to make it better in the short term? So my vision would be, and we've actually created an additional needs kind of checklist that people can fill in and send to us if they, either a professional or the person themselves can send that in. There's a QR code they can scan, they can do it on their phone, they can request a paper version and so on. That will then come through to me, that will then go into one of these sheets that will then feed into the systems that we do have in the back end. So it's very rudimentary at this point. And if you ask me what do I think the biggest risks are with this policy right now, I would say the data. It is, to me, we've got high ambitions, but if we can't get the data working, it's going to be virtually impossible to kind of really do that much. But then the bigger question that you asked was more around sharing across in a more kind of, I guess, strategic way. And again, so there's a work going on at the moment around a data strategy for the whole council. So the Liz Harrison's team is leading on that. And part of that will then feed into a housing strategy, a housing data strategy, where we will start to sort of map out where we can get data from other partners, where our data would be helpful to them, and how some of that information sharing works. The obvious place is benefits and homeless prevention, because they're the people who made applications to them are now our tenants. But is that flow of information working properly and smoothly? Probably not. But it is then the other services as well, like social care, like you mentioned, the fire brigade and so on. We obviously have to be mindful of data protection and GDPR and all of that, but it doesn't mean it's not possible to share more than we do. And we all know, don't we, that when there's a safeguarding investigation, it's very rarely that we've shared too much. It's usually that we haven't shared enough is what we get criticised for. So there's a lot of scope there, but again, it can feel so overwhelming when you look at this current sort of chaotic mess and think, how do we make sense of this? So we are at the start of a journey, not the end, but it's definitely on the cards, I would say.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helena and Charlie. Krista.
I was just going to say, I sit on the adult safeguarding board, and Shohel, he's got a really good way of getting the data live onto the dashboard. I don't know if it's worth you guys having a conversation, but I know safeguarding data on the day of presentations, like he can get it from the day before. So however they're feeding in to this safeguarding thing, and safeguarding is actually a good example of where they've created a form for professional people like ourselves to use, you know, like as a fast track form.
Yeah.
So we've got a form that if we've got a client that we're working with or a resident that we're working with that we're worried about something, we can just fast track it in. It just goes straight into somebody, and it works really, really effectively. And his data seems to be very real-time data. He's very good at pulling it up. So I don't know if, and they collect a lot of data, obviously, in safeguarding, so it might be worth having a conversation with him. Another suggestion could be like we're doing at Community of Practice, Charles and John, you know, with our shared library. So we're creating, as part of the community practice that I lead on, which is resident involvement stuff, we're creating a shared calendar, so there's not an overlap on events, and also a shared library of resources which will be stored on the Healthwatch website. So it's very secure, it will have its own page. So data that you can share, if you can share to like reliable, reputable partners, like if you share to like, I don't know, 5 to 10 solid partners in the community like Healthwatch, VCH, people like that, then it's going to go to the bigger audiences via us, as opposed to you having to share it to a million organisations, if that makes sense. And it would be stored somewhere safely. So that's always something you can do. And yeah, having maybe a shared library of your own data that you collected, the back historic data is quite good, because, for example, digital inclusion is a subject that residents have been asked the same questions about 84 times in the last year. And if the whole point is, if we could see previous work that's been done, we're not going to go out. So at the moment, we've done scoping work on digital stuff myself for another big bit of work that's coming up after the autumn term, NHS focused. And we've been scoping for the last 2 months to see what's been done already, so that we're not overlapping or asking residents the same questions and stuff like that. We know what the needs are. We know what the inequalities are. We've been asking residents for a year about them. So they're very clear. They haven't changed. So it's about addressing those needs and inequalities. I think residents get frustrated with being asked the same questions, but seeing nothing change. So this new wave of this new generation of the council blending with residents and co-producing and co-designing is absolutely the way forward to rebuild trust with residents as well, make them feel that they're involved and let them see that they're involved, that they're being listened to and their ideas are being heard and sort of taken into account.
I couldn't agree more. It's interesting that already the feedback that we're starting to, so I think we've had quite a lot of replies already to this consultation, and that trust thing is coming through really strongly. It's like you can say all the right words, but actually how are you going to deliver it? And you know, that is so coming through so strongly.
It's been like a lot of empty, but I'm a resident in the borough as well as a professional that works here, and I've lived here for 30 years, and it's been a lot. As a resident, professionally, you get a different view and a different working relationship than you do as a resident. And as a resident, it's a lot of empty promises and not really any delivery that you can see. As I'm just being quite honest, I don't really get that. If I had to name 10 things that the council do for me as a resident, as an actual resident, I'd be stretched. Working, I could stick 10 straight away. But as an actual ordinary mere mortal resident, it's not the same. So, and I think that's really important to take. There's no point listening to all these residents if you're not actually going to do the things that they're suggesting in, kind of thing.
Yeah, agreed. And sometimes it is doing those, what are the really quick things that we can quickly show people? Actually, a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is turning a very big oil tanker in a very rough sea, and it will take time, but they're going to be quick things that we probably can do now that we can show, you know, this is a change that we've made and this is the impact that it's had. And you know, like you say, I think that's so important in terms of rebuilding that trust, because I hear it all the time, and I can only imagine how frustrating it is.
Thanks, both. Pauline?
Yeah, Helena, I just wanted to ask on the data thing that you're building, if customer services was being considered as one of the people who would have, even if it was read-only access to what's going to be produced, because generally they're the first port of call, and if they're having to say, oh, take an email and send it on, whereas if they had sight, they can say, oh yes, I know this is happening, or you know, give some information, because most of the times that is what's most frustrating with residents. They stay on the line for however long, speak to someone who can't tell them anything.
Yeah.
And if they could have sight of what's there to say, yes, I can see something's in the work and this person's responsible, I can send them a message and ask them to call you. I could message the team and get someone to give you a call back or something, you know, that just make people think, well, yes, they know at least what I'm talking about. So that builds confidence and trust that, yeah, if I do call, someone will know what I'm talking about, even if they can't give me the answer, because half the time we can't resolve or give all the answers. But if you're at least aware of what's going on, that just inspires a little bit of confidence.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my vision would be that Ron Springer's team, you know, have access to all of the housing IT that we'll be using. I would absolutely, you know, to me, that's an absolute, like, definite, has to happen, because that first touch that we have with residents is so important. If we get that right, it sets the tone for the rest of the interaction. If we get that wrong, or it's frustrating, or people have to repeat themselves, or they feel they're not listened to, or, you know, like you say, the thing they told us last week isn't available in their notes, that's what winds them up. And I don't blame them for getting wound up, because that's what winds me up when I phone a call centre. You know, we're all human at the end of the day, aren't we? So yeah, I totally agree.
Thanks, Pauline. Does anyone else have any other questions or concerns or things to raise at this moment? Like I said, I'll share the the slides and the policy and everything in the newsletter. I was actually going to ask, going back to the data question, are there like obvious quick wins that are sort of waiting there to be exploited, if you like, but are just not, we just can't do them yet because of systems, data, etc.? Like, what would be the sort of, like, off the top of your head, 3 things that would be really good to be able to do?
So one of the things we've been talking about is this disproportionality and inequality thing. Are there specific groups of residents who are featuring more prominently in certain areas, like rent arrears or antisocial behaviour casework, or, you know, how are we almost segmenting our population of residents to understand their needs and offer the right help at the right time? That is a big programme. But for example, could we just add something really simple to when somebody makes a complaint, put an equalities monitoring form on the complaint, so that we're starting to capture equalities information at that moment in time. So in a year's time, you've got a whole year's worth of equalities information about complaints. So same with ASB, you know, in a year's time, we would be able to see a year's worth of equalities information. And from that, you could then start to make some investigations into, you know, is it people from a global majority background who are making the most complaints? Is there disproportionality in who gets those complaints upheld and who doesn't? You know, do we find that more people with mental health problems are being put on the cautionary contact list and targeted difficult residents? You know, I don't know the answers because we haven't got the data, but we could start to build that picture if we just, so it's not necessarily about making everything perfect. It's thinking about those small discrete areas where we could start to collect things and start to evidence some of these kind of impacts, because otherwise we'll be waiting for another 10 years and we've got to do something in the meantime. So I think they're the kind of areas that I'm interested in. You know, it's little things like tailoring our letters. So we, like, when I got here, it didn't even have sort of, if you need this in a different language, call this number. That wasn't on the letters. So it just put that on all the letters. You know, it might make a difference, it might not, but at least if it's there and people know they can do it, hopefully we wouldn't have that situation with that BSL situation that I just mentioned, where somebody's waited since April to get a sign language translator because that would have been put in front of them already and they'd know who to ask. So they're the little quick wins that I think we can do now. They're not going to make the big change, but it's incremental, isn't it? It's baby steps with some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had one more question as well, but unless anyone else has got something they want to raise. In terms of what are the main ways outside the consultation periods which residents, community partners can suggest improvements? Like, I know there's the housing surgeries, there's obviously complaints as like, you know, that would be a last resort, but like, what are the main routes in that someone could say, here's a quick win, this doesn't really make sense if you just did this in this way, it would make everyone's lives a bit easier?
So listening to Charles, he always says you can put all the stuff in place that you want, but it's about relationships. And I think that's absolutely true. I think there's an element of making clearer who those key contacts are, that if something isn't working. So Pauline, to your point about TMOs, you know, if you are not getting through to who you need to get to, just let me know and I will find a way through that for you. I can help you with navigating some of that stuff. Similarly with VCS partners, you know, I'm not going to be able to go to every single sort of locality meeting. I literally don't have the capacity. But if people know that I'm available and just drop me an email, drop me a line, we can start to have some of those sort of emerging. So like the meeting we had with Shelter, I think some people on the call were on a meeting that we held with Shelter last week, where we had a really great discussion about how they can feed into kind of the repairs process and this policy as well. And it just was a really nice meeting where I felt we got a really sort of positive outcome. So I'm always up for those kind of things. I think in the longer term, you know, my background, I worked in rough sleeping and homelessness for a long time. And we used to have like forums where we would all come together on a sort of quarterly basis, and some of the providers would be there, the council would be there, there'd be some service users there as well, probably like what you do in Health Watch, you know, and they worked quite nicely as well, where people could just have that kind of open dialogue and discussion. So, you know, maybe down the line we think about building some of those kind of forums in. Again, all of this is evolving, and, you know, a bit like Charles and I had a meeting with some hoarding people a little while ago, and it's like, the capacity is the main problem at the moment. We've only got a certain amount of capacity to do the work, and I get very enthusiastic about things and I want to do it all today, but reality is I can't. We've got to pace ourselves. So but it's building that kind of all those structures, and I think that is really what part of this policy is about, is those partnerships and how we develop them.
I think it's fair to say a lot of the policies needed to be started from scratch anyway, to be honest with you. They were probably written in a prehistoric time, and we've all moved on, thank goodness. And the borough's changed since a lot of the last policies were written, and they need to accommodate everybody. What you were saying makes sense, because with maternity, which is a big piece of work that we cover at the hospital, I started from a completely blank canvas as well. And I've just been able to pull together the first actual properly quartered monitored data, and out of all of those I was then able to highlight anybody who had any kind of protected characteristic and monitor their experience. So we were then able to look at those experiences as the more diverse members that had fed back, and who had fed back anything. It could disability, sexual orientation, whatever it might have been, any kind of protected character, and we were able to monitor their journey through the system and see, was it better, was it. And also the good thing about when you start building the picture, which I think is really important, you're able to feed back the good as well as pick up the bad. And I think staff sometimes need to hear, especially like customer services, Pauline's department, they take the flack of it all the time. It's interesting that the council, that if you ring any company now, they know who you are by your number. When you ring in, it recognises your number. And that's quite interesting that the council don't have that kind of system, because they could then build up a picture of their own residents quite easily. When people are ringing in, they'd recognise the number. Oh, is that Miss Brown? You know, like if you're a borough resident, they should be able to pick up things like that, because if you're buying something, everyone can do it. You know,
you'll be pleased to know the system, or, you know, that will be a key requirement of the system that we buy. It's got to be in there.
People like Pauline, if I ring in, they can see, oh, this, for example, I might have had a disability or whatever. Oh, this lady's registered with disabilities, whatever. You know, like that's how the picture keeps building. If things like that, and if you've got 1,000 departments all monitoring things separately and different elements of data, you're never going to get a cohesive picture. So maybe work out the data that you need to collect across everything, if that makes sense, and then you can get a running dashboard kind of thing. That's what we've had to do.
That is totally it. And I think this is where, you know, these Google forms that we've built, they're great in some ways, but they don't aggregate the data up, they don't make it visible to people. And
that's also Google Forms is not very secure for a big web. Been hacked. Like, I'm just saying, residents don't feel very assured using Google Forms. I can just point that out. We use Microsoft Google. You can never please everybody, but it's not a preferred, and I think people don't really trust it as a council form of submitting stuff, if that makes sense. Especially they think there should be something than a Google Doc that's a bit better, maybe.
I think on the Google Forms, Krista, I think I worked quite a lot on some housing related things prior to this role, and on Google Forms, I don't think when we were creating them, we thought they'd still be in use, four years later.
Yeah.
But such
The
as life.
workarounds
Yeah,
become the
right.
system,
Yeah.
haven't they? And it's
Yeah. Yeah, so I think when the system gets modernised and it needs those things come in, but I think for people like Pauline that are on the front line, they are the people that get the first call. If you're ringing up, for example, about council tax, you can get a direct line, but if you're ringing up about parking, for example, you can't. You have to do like a contact form. So people could quite often ring up irate about tickets, permits, whatever it could be. Poor Pauline's at the end of the phone. She doesn't know who the person is. There's no. And one of the worst things as a resident is sending off one of those contact forms and you just have to wait till somebody replies. Sometimes you get replies really quickly. I'm waiting for a reply on something now that I've been waiting for 3 weeks for. So, yeah, I've had the automated reply saying it's going to come, but I haven't had it yet. So I feel like having contact, as Pauline said, that people know who they're speaking to. The residents get peeved off with being passed the buck, as you said in your presentation, that passing of the buck. And if it's something really simple, that Pauline might be able to just advise that resident, they don't need to go on hold to another department or whatever, like it will make their jobs a lot easier on frontline customer services, and it will also keep residents a lot happier as well. And that's a really small fix kind of thing.
I agree 100%. Like I say, I think that first contact point is crucial. And, how on earth are we in housing ever expecting anyone to be able to answer any questions for us in the customer services team if they can't see any information? It's just a no-brainer. So I couldn't agree with you more. It's an absolute no-brainer to me.
So is the idea then, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding, is the idea to have one CRM across the council then, Helena? So, or data sharing permitting,
So the system that we're going to be buying is a housing system, and it will include a CRM that will be part of what the product suite has, the modules that we'll be buying. So I would say that will definitely be something that customer services people in Ron's team would be able to use. Whether that would then extend beyond into other parts of the council, I wouldn't be able to say. And I think we've wrestled a little bit internally with, I know there's been discussions around a corporate CRM, and are we almost jumping the gun by doing this? But we can't wait anymore. My staff can't wait anymore. We've got to have something. And I'm not saying this will be forever. The CRM, it might be that in years to come, the council does have a more corporate CRM that sits across everything, and we don't use ours, or what, I don't really know. But I think the feeling is we cannot carry on as we are, because it's got to the point where it's just untenable to carry on, and that's why we've had to just go out and buy something, which maybe we should have done that before, but it's easy to say these things with hindsight, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Helena. I don't know if anyone else has got any other questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. We usually sort of open up the floor for the last bit of the meeting, but I just wanted to say thanks, Helena. That was really rich discussion. I hope you got some useful feedback and discussion out of it. And I'll share all the info in the newsletter, so you might get some emails off the back of that as well.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me again. Really enjoyed it.
No worries. We've got 13 minutes left, so we usually open up the floors. If anyone has got anything they want to promote, any questions, any concerns around what sort of residents they're working with, now's your chance. I will kick us off, because I think last time I mentioned this as well. In first week of October, we're doing this meeting in person. So it's going to be at Caribbeats in Dalston. So Ali is usually on this call, so lots of you will know Ali from these meetings. So she's kindly going to host us. So it's the same time, 4 till 5:30, and it's October 3rd, I think. It's the first week of October. So we're really looking forward to it, and everyone is welcome. And we're going to be probably hearing from Ali about the sort of Caribbeats journey and the story, but then sort of have a sort of hopefully like an open discussion about how we work together and how we want to take that forward. So just putting it on your radar now, and I'll change the calendar invitation so that if that's how you use to access the meeting, you'll see the location and everything there. So just putting it on your radar. Anyone else want to come in at this point? Charlie?
just to flag something I've been kind of doing repeatedly recently. The council are working with an organisation called Crew Energy to deliver energy advice in community settings. Some of you may have bumped into them at different events recently, but if you are running an event in the autumn and you would like them to attend, reach out to me and we'll put you in touch, because I think we're keen to get that advice out there. And they're building the relationships in Hackney. They're originally from Wandsworth. We've kind of introduced them to people, but they want to learn more and more about the borough. They'll be there on the 3rd of October as well, but I think. But yeah, so just a shout out for that.
Nice one, thanks, Charlie. Anyone else want to come in at this point? Pauline.
Charlie, on your thing there, the Crew Energy, I'm just thinking the winter warmer events coming up.
Already there, Pauline, don't worry. We've got that on the
brilliant. Good.
Nice one, thanks, Pauline. Krista.
A couple of bits. For anyone who's not on the mailing list yet, we've got our next community of practice event coming up on the 25th of September at St Joseph's Hospice. If you're not on my mailing list and you want to join, it's at the footer of my email, or just let Charles or John know and they'll loop you in with me. Where this event is all about embracing diversity and fostering inclusive community relations. So our presenters on the day are we've got a really good line of presenters. We've got 5 presentations this time due to popular demand. So we've got an extra 2 presentations slotted in, including all the up-to-date health inequalities data is coming in. We've got Irene Mine speaking about some work they've done. Mary Federo's coming in from the council to talk about diabetes and faith. We've got Lola Akinyemi coming from the King's Park work. And who's the other one? I can't remember. Oh, Eve or something. Yeah, we've got great presenters anyway. So really good presentations coming on. A big meet and greet section with like 10, 12 different organisations. So if you fancy coming along, just let Charles or John and myself know. Richmond Road Surgery are doing a winter vaccine drive, hitting up any events or places, not to inject people, but just to promote health and advice and about vaccines and the new ones coming out for winter and stuff. I've got them through the mailing list that I do on a Friday, my weekly update. They're now partnered up with Hackney Food Bank, which is great. They're going to be going to their events to do it there. But if anyone's got any events coming up at the council that they would like them to come and sort of feature at for a health element, let me know and I'll link you in with Mahmouda. And there's a big bit of maternity work that we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. I've been promoting it on the weekly update. John, if you could share that particular piece of work on your updates for a couple of weeks till the deadline, I think it's like early September, that would be great. NHS Nell, we're designing a new maternity program, basically a new way of delivering services. Feedback shows that Labour's very, very good, but antenatal and postnatal is very hit and miss either way, and we need to deliver a sustainable service that's good from the beginning to end of the experience, the user experience, not just one bit of it. So there's a whole new programme being delivered. There's a lot of scoping work going on, a bit similar to Helena's scoping that she's doing for this policy. So if you could share that for me, John, that would be great as well. That's it. That's the Health Watch updates. Thank you.
Nice one. Thanks, Krista. Yeah, if you would want to send the info on to me, I'll put them in the newsletter. Abby.
Hi, everyone. Krista, you are a hard act to follow. I just wanted to share that we've got an organizer for food cooperatives that's starting up next week, actually, who's working with Cooperation Town. I'll put the link in the chat there. And this person is, when they get started, they're going to be out talking with people, meeting with people, sharing about what is a food cooperative, helping groups start those. If you're interested in Saul, that's the person's name. If you're interested in learning more, in getting connected with Saul, reach out to our team. You know, if you've got mine or John or Charlie's email or any of our emails, and you're interested in learning more about food cooperatives, we can put you on the list for Saul to get in contact with when they start up.
Great, thanks, Abby.
I'm only this energetic because I've been off for 3 days, Abby. I'm back. That's all. I've had 5 days off. That's all. Catch me by tomorrow afternoon. I'll be tired again. Don't worry.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Unless anyone else has got anything they want to raise now, we could probably wrap up and give you all 6 minutes back. So yeah, thanks again, Helena. Thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. That was